Welcome all. Welcome Jerry Grandey. Welcome Jeff, Kentaro, Shintako. I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad that we continue this conversation on megaton to megawatts. The cooperative nuclear disarmament and sustainability initiative is delighted to work on this. And we definitely think that this interview will be particularly relevant. There is a dimension of the process that is extraordinarily interlinked with Jerry Grandey experience, and Jeffrey Hughes is going to be our leader as always, and we are going to learn together. Jeff.
Well, thank you again, Jerry, for joining us today for this series of interviews we're conducting on the history of what is known as the HEU Deal, or interchangeably the megatons to megawatts agreement, which for a new listener or reader would be an agreement that the US government and the Russian government signed in 1993 that went to 2013 that rid the equivalent of over 20,000 nuclear weapons worth of highly enriched uranium from Russian nuclear weapons and diluted it in Russia into fuel suitable to be used in civilian nuclear reactors, which was completed over 20 years in a very complex, what turned out to be a very complex set of agreements, producing roughly 10% of the US's electricity over that period without carbon. And so while it rid roughly of a third of the Earth's weapons materials, there's still a lot left. And so whether or not this is a model that could ever be followed in the future, I guess time will tell. To say just a few words about Jerry for context, there'll be a more detailed bio of him posted on the website next to his interview. But for high-level context, Jerry was born in the United States, in California. He went to he was a geoengineer at the Colorado School of Mining. That was after service in the military in the tumultuous 60s for a couple of years. He then got his law degree at Northwestern, and he had forays into the nuclear area, dealing with reactors. I'll let him speak to that. But then he got into the marketing of natural uranium before going from there to become the senior vice president at Cameco in the 1990s, dealing with some of the most difficult challenges for the HEU deal in that period. And then finally becoming the CEO and president of Cameco in the 2000s period, helping steer the agreement, which was running on a smoother basis for the balance of the deal. So with that, I'll just start right into it, Jerry. I don't know if you have any thing that you'd like to say about, like, how did you get into the uranium business, even before we get to some of the details of the challenges of the uranium market in the United States, as well as the challenges of dealing with surprises like the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You bet. So thank you, Jeff and Andrea. Start out with a little bit of an embellishment. My dad worked on the Manhattan Project
Oh, I didn't know that.
in Los Alamos, and he and my mother lived there. In fact, if I do the math right, I was conceived in Los Alamos, and then they moved to Long Beach, and that's where I was born, Long Beach, California. Briefly, very interested in geology. Wanted to get away from the parents and home, so Colorado looked attractive. I wanted to engage in skiing, so the Colorado School of Mines was a logical choice near the ski slopes. And your introduction was a little bit reversed. I did the School of Mines degree first in geophysics, and then 2 years of military duty, principally on the DMZ in South Korea. Probably they're about as hazardous as being in Vietnam, but at any rate, I went back to law school And there's a very interesting intersection there. 3 years at Northwestern, I was on the GI Bill, but I still had to work to be able to pay for rent and food and whatnot. So I went to work for a public interest law firm called the Businessmen and Professionals for the Public Interest, or BPI. And they were challenging the licensing of nuclear reactors around the Great Lakes. They had been engaged in the Calvert Cliffs decision, which basically established the principle that NEPA applied not just to government projects, but to projects that the government was going to license or approve, which changed the whole field of environmental regulation by the federal government. Um, my principal mentor at BPI was a gentleman by the name of David Comey, and he was a mentor of Tom Cochran's.
Oh,
And Tom and I never intersected, but over the years, when Tom and I would interact, we would always talk about David being a mentor. So from, one perspective, I worked for BPI for the 3 years I was in law school. And it was basically opposing the construction of nuclear plants for a number of pretty legitimate reasons back then, principally related to thermal pollution of the Great Lakes that, nobody could answer the question. And, the design of high pressure pipes that went under the control room and these kinds of things. So, uh, we had a good time. So then I
one of
graduated and decided to go back to Colorado to ski, got a job with the largest law firm in Colorado, Holland and Hart. And because of the resource technical background, they basically put me in the mining environmental area of practice. And I had a range of clients from big mining companies, most of whom have disappeared, but Anaconda, Asarco, etc., and a number of sort of more entrepreneurial junior mining companies. And but coincidentally, a lot of the senior partners at the law firm decided that they were going to go do something else. So one became an editor of the Telluride Times, one went Johns Manville, and with 2 years into my practice, I was one of two senior mining lawyers. And I found that I enjoyed working with the small clients a lot more than with the big ones because the small ones would bring you into strategy development, goal setting, objectives, fundraising. You got the perspective of what they needed to be successful. Large ones basically were more discrete, tax issue, smelter issue, whatever. So at the end of 4 or 5 years, I left the law firm and went with a junior mining company called Energy Fuels. And that was founded by one of the early pioneers in the uranium industry, back when uranium was still purchased by the US government at a regulated $8 a pound. And all of these, small-time geologists and explorers were out looking for uranium deposits in the West. And the founder, the entrepreneur in this case, Bob Adams, was a pilot in World War II. And so he had his airplane in Wyoming, fly over the Red Desert area with his Geiger counter suspended out of the cockpit, record an anomaly, drop bags of flour, and then go back and stake his mining claims. And he was successful. He built the company called Western Nuclear, and then that was purchased by Phelps Dodge. So first he started over in the coal mining business with a coal mine outside of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And then once that was becoming successful, and that's about the time that I joined him as general counsel. So we were doing the first permitting under the Surface Coal Mining Act in the country and getting coal leases when I think it was Jimmy Carter had put a moratorium on them of all federal coal leasing, but there were exceptions that we invented. But at the same time, we established a sister company called Energy Fuels Nuclear. And the whole idea was if you go to southeastern Utah and you build a mill, that will rejuvenate all of the mom and pop mines that operated under the AEC buying program back in the 50s and 60s that's shut down when the US government was no longer buying. So if you built the mill, you'd reactivate those mining operations that would feed the mill, and then you were back in the uranium mining business. And recall at the time, uranium, because the commercial nuclear power sector was just beginning to take off, Westinghouse was caught short of supply. They had sold a lot of reactors guaranteeing supply. And then all of a sudden, for a lot of reasons, including an international cartel, they didn't have the uranium. So uranium prices went from $6 a pound to 42.
Wow.
So, we got the mill up and running. An interesting fact at the time, Bob's personal financial advisor, he was not an employee of the company, was Orrin Benton. So I was working for Bob Adams. Orrin Benton was basically a colleague because he was full-time. He had come out of Arthur Andersen, and he was, again, the full-time financial advisor to Bob. So indeed, building the mill, reactivating the mines, all of that worked fine. We ended up discovering some very high quality mines in Arizona. And even though after 3 Mile Island, the price began to decline, we ended up being quite successful. And in 1992, Bob Adams passed away from a massive heart attack. And that was in New York. We were about ready to have meetings with our Swiss utility partners who owned about 40% of the assets that we had accumulated uranium assets in the Four Corners area. Shortly after that, all of his senior people who had been my mentors at this entrepreneurial company decided they'd seen enough of the ups and downs of the uranium industry. They had all made their own personal fortunes along with Bob. And so I became president at age of about 32, 33, something like that. And my colleagues were of an equal age. And Bob's son, John Adams, who had no history in either the coal industry or the uranium industry, other than being the son of Bob, took as his share of the inheritance the company. So we had that continuity. And at that time, Orrin Benton left because he was no longer needed as a financial advisor to Bob. And a few years later, he bought the company Nuexco from the General Electric people that had founded it. And that'll become important a little later. But when Orrin Benton left, we discovered that he had borrowed some of our Swiss utility partners' uranium inventory. So they, under our partnership or joint venture with the Swiss, they were entitled to 40% of our production. And lo and behold, we discover that Orrin Benton had borrowed it, unbeknownst to anybody, sold it so that Bob Adams, before he died, could buy a 40% interest in the Denver Broncos.
That was Ben's team.
All of a sudden, John Adams has got 40% of the Broncos, and that was fun. Lots of stories here, which I'm going to skip. So time goes on, we become the largest producer in the United States. And keep hearing about these deposits in Canada that are 5%, 2%, 20%, which would only mean that if and when they went into production, their cost of production would be considerably lower, viewed as a threat. Benton buys New Mexico in the mid 80s, and he begins working with the Russians on sourcing civil uranium, again under quotes, because you could never be sure. And his game plan was, because the market price is declining, after TMI, lots of utilities living on inventories they had built up or selling inventories they no longer needed because they were no longer going to build their nuclear plants.
Mhm.
Benton was borrowing uranium from the utilities, selling it, for example, at $20 a pound, knowing that he could replace it later, he could repay the loan with much cheaper Russian material, which is exactly what he and his New Mexico people were doing. And obviously, doing that, in essence, drove the price down even lower and ultimately ended up in the dumping case. Now, because the price was going down and nuclear was out of favor, and Jane Fonda was having a lot of fun opposing nuclear plants, most of the oil companies were exiting. A lot of companies were beginning to put their uranium production on standby, like IMC and Freeport and others. And being president of Energy Fuels, I kind of became the last man standing in the industry that had much knowledge and background. So I was with the American Mining Congress. I became the head of the Uranium Policy Council. The Uranium Producers of America, I became the president of the UPA. I went on the board of the Uranium Institute in London. So that, just by being the last person standing, put me in these leadership positions, right? And of course, the industry was whining for help because it just couldn't survive the onslaught of the Russian uranium being brought in by New Mexico. And Canada had begun to produce at a very low cost. And then you had, other producers outside of the US that were still continuing to produce and sell. So we went to the US government and begged for some kind of help. Jeff, you look like you want to ask a question.
No, I was
And
just going to clarify. I was
please
just
interrupt me because this goes
No,
on
no,
way
no.
too
I
long.
was just thinking that you said Russian uranium, and I guess we mean Soviet uranium at the
Soviet
outset.
uranium, yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And so the case was brought, I think, in October 1991, just shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, the case was actually, in my recollection, we started the case earlier than that. But we had two, well, we have one avenue, which was the protection the industry had under the Atomic Energy Act, which said if the enrichment industry is not viable, or the U.S. uranium industry is not viable, then you, theoretically, you limit the import of foreign source uranium. So we went to Congress. We argued that that was the case. We went to the agencies. So in the process of that, I really ended up meeting a lot of people in the U.S. Congress wearing out a lot of shoe leather in DOE. Um, and ultimately, nobody really listened to us. So we brought a lawsuit and we won, urging or saying that the U.S. government was supposed to limit foreign sourced uranium. And indeed, there was a DOE finding that the industry was not viable and still refused to limit the import of foreign sourced uranium. So we took that finding, one at the district court level, one at the appellate court level, took it to the Supreme Court, thinking, how can you possibly lose? And we lost 9-0.
Wow.
So then we faced this will all become relevant, sorry.
No, no.
Then we faced the negotiation of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, or what was back then referred to as NAFTA, before Trump got involved. And we wanted to protect the provision that we thought we were going to prevail on and have the ability to exclude this Canadian uranium, which was beginning to be sold in the US market as a very significant competitor. And here again, we lobbied hard in Congress, lobbied with the USTR, lobbied with the OC, et cetera, et cetera. We aligned ourselves with the Farmers Union because they too were trying to keep out Canadian products. The last issue settled at the 11th hour on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was the uranium issue, and we lost. And they got the ability to override that provision in the Atomic Energy Act, basically saying Canadian uranium could not be restricted. And that prevailed, and there was, some trade-offs in that in terms of consultation, and there wouldn't be any actions taken by the US government that would hurt Canadian uranium production and imports. So, um, as head of the UPA, the Uranium Producers of America, and seeing the price of uranium continuing to decline because of, again, the import by New Mexico of the Soviet Union uranium, we initiated the dumping action. There had been one previous successful dumping action on fertilizer, on urea, and that had been brought by Freeport as a producer of phosphate and urea as well, which is a nitrogen fertilizer. And they were the ones on the UPA because they were also a producer of uranium from their phosphate deposits, urging us to bring a dumping action. So we did, and hired legal counsel in DC. And the name of the firm, I think, was Aiken Gump. And it was Val Slater, who had been, I think, an associate on the dumping case with urea, to lead the effort on the uranium case. And over time, as we took this forward, we ultimately prevailed. And that affected the Soviet Union and all of its production centers. So that brings us to around 1990, 91, thereabouts, I guess.
Did,
Um, So New Mexico then buys Energy Fuels in 1990. And who's in charge of New Mexico but Warren Benton? And my experience with Warren Benton says, here's a gentleman you cannot trust.
A tax lawyer.
Yeah. Oh, and he was always living on the edge from a tax perspective. Never knew which side he was going to fall on. So I basically said, okay, I'll stay for about a year of transition to make this seamless. And then I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go ski or do whatever. So by that time, the suspension agreement, the dumping case had matured enough. And I'm not sure, Jeff, whether it had actually gone into effect. Recollection's a little bit fuzzy. But in the summer of 91, he wanted me to go to the Soviet Union and visit all of their uranium production and fuel fabrication sites to help them defend and prove that they weren't dumping. Well, it was an opportunity to go to see a part of the world that I hadn't been to since the People to People tour in 1968. So I went, and it was over a 2 to 3 week period of time. And I did this over 2 summers.
Wow.
Went to every production site in the former Soviet Union. Oftentimes, the first Westerner, maybe among just a few that had been there. So that would have been certainly in Russia proper, Ukraine, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan.
Wow.
And I met all of the leaders of the combinat enterprises producing uranium. And in-depth tours, studies, secret books, production schedules, costs, all of which was under their 5-year meaningless plan. Produce your quota, we'll send you rubles, and nobody has a clue what it cost.
And this is a period, well, the Soviet economy is collapsing during this period. I mean, there was a coup attempt in August 91,
Absolutely collapsing.
and there was desperation to sell to get hard currency such as uranium. And so it was kind of a downward spiral of a
Yeah.
spiral of sales.
And every place I went, they wanted to enter into a joint venture so they could sell directly and get out from under the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Atomic Energy and perhaps the rest of the Soviet Union. And I did one, a joint venture over the head of the Minister of Atomic Energy.
Whoa. They were called MAPI then, I think it was, but not
Yeah,
quite
it was
that.
happy then, but yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Wow.
Well, I did it with Krasno-Kamensk, and the leader of Krasno-Kamensk, a gentleman who became a very good friend, Stahl Pokrovsky. And his name appears in the HEU deal once in a while. Stahl, of course, means steel. And he was every bit of that. But he wanted this joint venture, and he was the potentate for Siberia, basically, and able to overcome whatever objections the Minister of Atomic Energy had. And it all became meaningless, right? But I can remember sitting in our celebrations in Moscow, where Prokofsky was in charge and the minister was just sitting there. In any event, because of those trips, and I did it, I repeated it in 1992, other sites. And we studied and researched, and there was no way that one could conclude that they were not dumping. But then they had no idea, and they were being taken advantage of by Benton. But he was their sole source of cash, hard currency, right? And uh, and he was investing a lot back in those enterprises,
Mm.
turning them into toothpaste factories and on and on and on. It was an interesting time.
Well, if I could ask you, Jerry, the time frame we're talking about now, um, it the HEU idea op-ed by Tom Neff was October 1991, and then by early 1992, um, the historical record now shows that Yeltsin was made aware of the concept, and Velikov accompanied him to the Camp David summit with President Bush 41 in February, at which the rough concept of a HEU sales or plutonium sales came up, and Baker followed up on that quickly with, and a team was initiated to begin to start with talking with the Russians in the first half of 1992. I'm just curious, when was the first time that you were sort of made aware of the HEU deal concept? Did you hear anything about that in your visits over that period in Russia? Did that start to affect some of the background music for nuclear sales and cooperation going forward? A long time ago, I recognize too.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. And I'll just keep hitting my head here to try to remember, but no, Jeff, there was really no hint in the 91, 92 visits that any of this was going on. There were rumors in the industry in 92 that something like this was going to be coming, or perhaps.
Mhm.
There were always rumors, but you've already the industry, particularly in the U.S., had already been completely pummeled by the import of or the dumping of the civilian Russian or Soviet material, and so numb that, okay, so there's going to be more for another 10, 20 years. We're already dead.
Oh no.
And so there was always that in the background in probably the 92, but again, it was just from an industry observer perspective. Okay, something's going on. Maybe there's going to be more Russian material or Soviet material. Is there really any difference? There's some confusion about what was going on. We got the suspension agreement. How does that play into all this? Maybe there's protection there. Maybe we have to reinforce it. But now remember, Energy Fuels is owned by Benton or New Mexico, actually by Benton. And I had to resign, obviously, as president of the UPA.
Mhm.
So now I'm trying to figure out, is there really dumping or not? And is there any defense? And can we work out a deal with the members of the UPA or the US producers, that maybe gives the Russians a little bit of room in the market, but also goes away to protect the U.S. producers. But they had already won this on with a suspension agreement. There was no interest in compromising with Benton or New Mexico. So they basically told them to pound sand. But the important fact coming out of all of these trips and meeting all of these commandant leaders in the various production sites, I would then return to Moscow and brief the senior leadership in the Ministry of Atomic Energy, or back then what was Menape or whatever it was called.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I ended up meeting the minister of the time, McCarran and Titchkoff, and all of these people that were on the more commercial side. I never did at that time meet Mikhailov. Um, so, I mean, but I did have that introduction. So, as a result of being the head of the UPA, the negotiations on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, my trips to Moscow. I really ended up with contacts in the U.S. government, state, DOE, commerce, and in the Soviet Union. And of course, it was unraveling in the 1992 period of time, and unraveled.
Right.
And then we were dealing with not just Russia, but the CIS republics, and what did that mean under the suspension agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, I'll stop.
I was just as a historical benchmark, I think it was President Bush in August of 1992, based on that earlier Spade work, to talk about what would an HEU deal begin to look like. President Bush announced that the Department of Energy would be seeking to arrange a contract over the following year to buy some of their HEU, amount unspecified. And so that was sort of out there publicly and became enmeshed with compensating Ukraine for their HEU and getting their weapons out. So that was a whole nother kind of tangle that started to be sorted out. And then it wasn't until February 1993 that that deal that had been worked on over the following in 92 came to fruition and was signed by the new Minister of Manadam, Mikhailov, as well as his counterpart, General Burns. And so anyway, I'll stop there and ask, well, I was going to say that Congress in that same 92 period, they passed legislation seeking to privatize the U.S. enrichment capability and create the U.S. Enrichment Corporation, a government corporation to be followed perhaps by privatization, as well as they specifically in the legislation mentioned the HEU agreement as a possibility. And so there was some sense of trying to marry up the future U.S. enrichment capability with the HEU deal. And I believe the idea was to allow the imports of Russian uranium pursuant to the HEU deal, but then keep up some of the suspension agreement type walls around other civilian uranium commerce.
Yeah, exactly. And all of those elements were at play for a number of years, as you well know. Sort of the uncertainty of just how broad is the suspension agreement to be read? Does it include enriched uranium or not? Or is it just, uranium itself? What about conversion? And what is the role of DOE and what's the future of the enrichment plants? And ultimately, what happens if and when USEC, which becomes an entity a little bit later, what's that entity, how is its behavior going to affect the uranium market, et cetera, et cetera. So
having commercial incentives, not simply federal government incentives for USEC.
exactly. So anyway, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So back to the kind of the timeline. I leave, energy fuels and Benton behind to spend a little bit of time skiing. And then I'm recruited by Cameco to come to Saskatchewan, and which I barely knew where it was.
It's hard to spell
and
too.
become the senior VP of marketing and corporate development. And consulting with the wife and family, thought that'd be a great adventure, not realizing that in the wintertime it's 30 and 40 degrees below 0 Celsius.
Good training for Russia
Doesn't
too.
make any difference at 40, it's the same. And I start January 1, 1993. And it wasn't long into that the concern over this potential HEU deal is elevated among the industry generally. And of course, it's a conversation that we're engaged in at Cameco because once again, it's viewed as a threat to the market and a threat to the business and its viability. We're producing at a pretty low cost out of two properties, but getting ready to invest in two more that were extraordinarily high grade, but much more difficult to mine. And so we've got the future to worry about, our ability to make these investments, bring on additional production that, both the province and Canada are very interested in because it's Canada's level of production and involvement in the world market that always gave Canada a seat at the table when nuclear matters were being discussed because they had foregone enrichment, feeling good about themselves, but they had participated in the Manhattan Project and they had supplied uranium to the U.S. in the 50s from Canadian sources. So hands not completely clean.
When uranium was so scarce in that period that it was such a controlled kind of weapons
Exactly.
usable
Exactly.
material that the competition between
Yeah.
the US and Germany and so forth.
Yeah. So HEU was a topic of discussion. I find out that Tom Neff has been a consultant with Cameco. And Tom, I knew, but I did not know well. I knew him probably just because of, his attendance at various seminars or symposia over the years. And he'd spoken or I'd spoken. And so, at Energy Fuels and with the UPA, we had never engaged Tom in any capacity, but he was a consultant on the market to Cameco, and I think other people as well. So that was part of his consulting business. Um, so I very quickly in January of 93 began to talk with Tom about the HEU deal and what it meant potentially for the market. And Tom's great concern that nobody really understood how this could be implemented. How is all of this going to be absorbed, both of the enrichment or the conversion, and the uranium? How's that going to be absorbed in the market and meet Russia's expectations that they were going to get paid billions of dollars for selling their national patrimony? And Tom was noodling on how that could be orchestrated. And he and I chatted at least 3 times a week as things evolved about the dynamics, the changing positions, the overtures, the consternation within the US government, probably violating, Jeff, all kinds of confidentiality provisions. Tom's passed, so good luck. And this went on for a decade, right? Of conversations. And there were periods of time when it just went quiet. And so many, as you were being engaged in it, so many ideas and so many discussions about the suspension agreement, what it meant, what and efforts to change Petrini's mind, DOC, and how broad was it, and what was the Russians' reaction to theoretically being hoodwinked on not being paid for the uranium component, and expecting that they would get paid, and would you get paid only when it got used or sold? Was overfeeding a possibility? How many enrichment plants were going to be sacrificed? Was overfeeding possible? Was it even economic compared to the purchase of the enrichment by DOE? Was it even economic to operate the enrichment plants? All
Hmm.
of this was going on for years, basically. And so, Tom encouraged us to get involved with the Russians immediately or as quickly as we could to begin talking to them about some way that Cameco could help at least the feed component conversion come into the market without having the rest of the producing industry completely opposing it and doing everything they possibly could to block it, while more importantly, meeting the Russian expectations that they would get paid for the uranium component, the feed component of the material. And of course, there were issues about contamination. Could their blended down material be actually sold? Did it have too much 234, too much 236? Could Cameco help if we were blending it down with uranium concentrates from our own inventory? I mean, all of this was explored in great detail.
Hmm. Do you still
And
have some of your memos from Tom in a file folder?
I don't have too many memos. I've got lots of copious notes. I just made it a practice of when the conversation was going on, of just writing down what people were saying. Now, not 100% foolproof. Tom did not produce much, and it would be residing now at Cameco if there is. I'm sure over time there were a number of analyses and memos and drafts of things that he was going to send to state, DOE, or to the Russians about, here are some possibilities. Trying to run it by us because, Tom, I think, properly viewed Cameco as the only Western producer outside of government-owned ones, i.e., the French, the only Western producers that had the financial resources to meaningfully invest in a transaction on the HEU deal. And at the time, the approach was, well, somebody's going to have to build up a huge stockpile of feed component, can't be sold too quickly because of the suspension agreement. And you're going to have to pay the Russians as it's delivered. So you got a huge investment in inventory, and you won't get a return on that investment until much later when you can begin selling it. And of course, the big issue was, well, who owns it? Does DOE own it? Do the Russians own it? Um, all of those things were at play, but Tom was convinced that a deal could be done that would satisfy the Russians' interest in getting paid and sort of help this thing, which was his primary objective, was make sure this thing goes on for 20 years and succeeds.
think you likened, I think you've likened the Russian uranium as an above ground mine, which you had to kind of do a trade-off between developing those two
Yep.
sites you mentioned in.
That concept came up very early between Tom and me. I don't know who raised it first, but in effect, it is a very high grade mine,
Mhm.
and the rest of the industry is going to have to adjust, and it needs to be transparent. Everybody needs to know the rules so that they can make their own investment decisions, including Cameco and our partner up here in Saskatchewan, the French-owned company that at the time was named Kojima. Every time it's gone bankrupt, they've gone through name changes, but
Rebranding.
as the French government has recapitalized them. a luxury we didn't have.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned DOE a moment ago. It's the DOE owned the enrichment facilities until USEC was stood up in the beginning of 1993 by the legislation, and then it creates this government corporation and with the glide path to become private. And so then this whole question of ownership couldn't have been more complicated than it was in that transition period
Yeah.
to work out some of these contractual things.
And there were a lot of statements made to other actors in the industry and indeed by USEC itself that they were going to be selling this material as best they could. But if you realize that USEC had no interest in the price of uranium, they just wanted to unload it. That hence any sales by USEC as a trader, i.e., buying from the Russians and selling it in the market, was viewed as a huge threat. And I've got quotes from other people in the industry where Timbers, at some point in time when he appears on the scene, saying he's going to become the biggest uranium trader in the business. Well, you can imagine that sent shockwaves through the producing industry.
And that stems in
Another
part,
another Orrin Benton, basically, right?
when that stems from utilities having to provide the natural uranium to USEC, they become the sort of handler of natural uranium for the purposes of enrichment in the United States.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And then you got the issue of, okay, so it's delivered by the utilities. U.S. producers or producers generally no longer need to produce that because it's already being held and it can be then sold back to utilities. Well, then what is the origin? Is it Russian? Is it Canadian? Is it Australian? I mean, what's the origin of that material? Since it's in the blended down, or not in the blended down, but basically there's been a notional swap of material between Russian and whatever original origin that material was. So it was complicated. And all of that needed to be clarified. So we had a number of meetings in Moscow. Um, Very first one, I flew over there, I think in the March period of time in 93, maybe
That
June.
makes sense. Right after the agreement was signed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I met with Valerie Bogdan and then with Mikhailov.
Mikhailov was just in the process of being appointed the new minister of the new Manhattan
Exactly.
between February and March.
And said, look, here's the threat to the market. And nobody has a clue about how this can get solved so that you can get your money. And even then, I don't think they realized who owns it, where they're going to get paid, how are they going to get paid. They just knew from experience of dumping the civilian material that too much material in the market was not good, and that needed to be addressed somehow. And that partly true of LEU as well as conversion and uranium.
Mhm.
And of course, we were there to try to talk about the feed component. And we proposed to them a joint venture where we would invest in the pile of feed component it was being built up in the US or wherever. Um, well, I don't know how many trips we took to Moscow or met them in DC or where they nodded and said, we'll get back to you. And then they raised the fact that, oh, competitors were interested as well, and that your terms are not the price you're willing to pay isn't the magical 28.50 that they needed, which I think was the time was about $13 US, which you couldn't ever make money unless you believe the price of uranium was going to go high. So, I mean, we were haggling over terms. It never the discussions never got to be that serious. But they kept encouraging us to come back as they entertained overtures from traders and brokers, including New Mexico, from Allied Nuclear Fuel Services, Babcock and Wilcox, Kojima, um, and others who were trying to as well address this issue, but basically in a trading brokerage capacity.
I
So,
might I might ask here, I think by this time, um, the previous Orrin Benton transactions and then bankruptcy left him shorting Manhattan by about roughly 100 million.
yeah, yeah.
So,
So he goes bankrupt in 95 or
okay,
thereabout,
but the
and
bill,
left them with about 100 million, I think, and utilities with that he had borrowed uranium from, promising to pay them back with Russian uranium, which was no longer available to him because of the suspension agreement and bankruptcy. Leaving utilities, Japan, Europe, and the US owed hundreds of millions of dollars as well. I think the bankruptcy in total was about a $500 million splash. He had about 65 different companies when he went bankrupt.
wow.
That's a whole nother story.
But I didn't recognize at the time that Benton overlay and how it may have affected Mikhailov's sort of willingness to trust the commercial operations of the
Exactly.
market because they had been screwed
It
once
left
before.
very sour taste. And of course, I had been affiliated in their view with Benton. So in the back of my mind, that was always an issue.
Right.
Is that somehow jading their view, coloring their view of my capacity now with Cameco? And it would have been understandable.
And you mentioned the joint venture, and it reminds me that going back over the records, Mikhailov wanted to have joint ventures with USEC as well as apparently with you. And I think part of the problem um, of realizing that sentiment was that things like the absence of an agreement for nuclear cooperation with the Soviet Union and now Russia because the persisting Iran agreement. So you couldn't even you couldn't execute the kind of joint venture that he wanted to do at the time, and so I think that probably increased his frustration. I'm wondering if Mikhailov seems to have arranged that Manhattan would receive the proceeds from the enrichment component of the HU agreement, and the natural uranium component would go eventually to the finance ministry. I mean, and he could always complain about the natural uranium component. I'm wondering if you think he had a sense, he understood there were U.S. domestic objections and market problems, and he would get what he could when he could immediately, and then he would use the natural uranium component as a club. But and he would later even try to capture perhaps the revenue from that part of the deal as well. But I don't know if
No,
you,
you're triggering a recollection because Tom and I talked about that a number of times. Did Mikhailov have the authority? That was an issue in Russia. And who is entitled to the value of the feed component? And I think he assumed, yes, the ministry would get the value of the enrichment component. But who in Russia was going to get the value of the feed component? And that had to be worked on by Mikhailov over a period of time. And ultimately, from Tom, it got sorted out. And I'm not quite sure I remember, but I think it was the Ministry of Finance that ultimately was entitled to the revenue of the feed component.
that jives with my recollection. Around 1997, perhaps.
Um, well, my recollection is that resolution in Russia, and maybe it wasn't final, would have occurred sometime in 1994. where Mikhailov gets the authority in writing, and then he's already sorted out his internal fights about who gets the value of the feed component. And maybe that got undone later.
And I think you're right. There was a decree in 94 that tried to write down some of these rules of the
Yeah,
road. And I believe it was also based on the premise on their own internal document of full compensation, which they would call the original agreement, even though they would
they,
sign an implementing contract in January 94 that kind of split the components and gave USEC
yeah,
the freedom of action to decide when to compensate on the naturally
right,
uranium component,
exactly.
potentially when used, or you said earlier, when used or sold, but certainly by the end of the agreement, but that could be 20 years.
Those were the magic words that kept getting thrown back to the Russians, and it was driving Tom crazy, and because he disliked intensely Nick Timbers, who didn't become a friend of mine either.
When did
But
do you
he did
recall when you
not
first
trust. Say again.
do you remember when you first met Phil Sewell, who was threaded throughout this agreement as
So
you are from the
Phil,
commercial side, from
when Phil
DOE then to
comes,
USEC?
Phil comes on the scene late 93, 94. He's assigned to the Enrichment Corporation, USEC, as a representative. And Tom's view of Phil, he's a little bit more, he's kinder to Phil than he was to Timbers, but he viewed Phil as basically just doing the bidding of ultimately DOE, USEC, and Nick Timbers when Timbers becomes in charge.
I note that Phil was actually part of a DOE team that engaged with the Russians in the early part of 1992. So he was like a deputy assistant secretary in DOE,
Yeah, yeah.
and then made the jump over to USEC, as you say, in the beginning of 93 when USEC was stood up. So it was that familiarity with the actors in Russia and the DOE complex that then um,
Yeah.
followed him to USEC.
So speaking of Phil, I mean, I probably traveling to Moscow once every 3 months in the early part of this, less frequently every 6 months, but almost every time I was over there was Phil Sewell. And we both stayed at the Penta Hotel. And we'd say, hi, Phil, or going into Manhattan, the building, the ministry. Oh, Phil's exiting, or I'm exiting. Hi, Phil. You making any progress? And then it became Yves Coupon with Kojima, the French. Oh,
Mhm.
hi. You getting anywhere? So, um, sort of back to the first couple of years. I mean, literally, Tom and I were talking 3 times a week, Saturdays, Sundays, about what is transpiring and all the confusion, what needs to be done, how we should approach it. Um, and then sometime in 93, and you're going to have to help me here, maybe 94, the suspension agreement is modified to bring in the matching program. And that was to help quiet down the U.S. producers who were still suffering from low prices. And I think the U.S. government was concerned about will there be any U.S. production at all? Um, we got to throw them a lifeline. So they designed the matching program that said for every pound of Russian material coming in at a low cost, if the U.S. producer had a contract with the utility, they could match it and basically achieve the blended price. And that riled, obviously, Canada. and every other producing country, Namibia, South Africa, Australia. Were you a DOE at the time? Because if you were, they probably all came to visit you.
Yeah, I was at DOE at beginning late 93 and starting early
Yeah.
94, coming over from the State Department.
Everybody was going to the US to whine about this matching program and being unfair, preferential, but nobody except Canada had a leg to stand on. But Canada had NAFTA with the and I haven't gone back to look at it, but the representations that if Canada had access to the US market, the US wouldn't take any actions to diminish it as part of NAFTA. And of course, the matching program did exactly that. It gave US material preferential treatment through matching over Canadian government material that could not be matched. And so there was another issue that Cameco was concerned about that we were then, beginning to work on diplomatically, briefing the Canadian government about how this violated NAFTA.
My recollection was that the price, it would be matched only if it hit a certain price target, and then that tended not to happen. And so the proposed fix
Didn't work.
didn't work even from the US standpoint. And then that
Exactly.
led to another um, effort to address this issue by Domenici, if I recall, it was around 95, and that's the one that um, awarded ownership to Russia of uranium at USEC, which had consequences, um, and it allowed an increasing scale of sales over time, over 10, 20 years, that I think increasing by 2 million pounds or something. But it was this awarding title to Russia upon deliveries from payment in St. Petersburg automatically created Russian uranium in the United States at USEC, their feed component, which became consequential for trying to keep the HEU agreement on track, because it really still couldn't be sold into the market, and nor could it be sent back to Russia. So it was kind of, I think Mikhailov called it orphan uranium. And so that was a challenge in and of itself. And then USEC privatization, which actually did occur in January 1998, that had consequences in terms of revelations about their inventory, which I'll leave to your recollection, which must have been more shocking.
Yeah. So you're right. I think it was 95. And again, Tom and I, talking about all of the issues, questions about ownership, and you're absolutely correct. The Russians were under the impression that this material could not be returned to Russia. And so picking up on the idea that you had to make this look like a new mine coming into production, and to resolve the issue once and for all, who owned it, and keep it out of USEC's clutches, because they wanted to become the world's biggest trader and broker with the free use of this material, paying for it only when it was used or sold. Tom was desperate, and then working with Domenici's people to put into legislation to clarify those issues and have a quota that made it look like a new mine coming into production. So, that was Tom Neff.
Working with Alex Flint and the Domenici staff. And
Alex and Domenici staff, and coming back to us, what should the schedule be? What would mine look like? What Cameco, how would you react to that transparency in terms of your future investments in McArthur River, Cigar Lake, which were very high grade mines, 20% uranium, unheard of, beginning to be developed and coming into the market?
I think ultimately you ended up increasing Canada's, Cameco's world production from 10% up to like 16 or more percent over your tenure. So
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Hmm.
against this backdrop then of the 95 legislation and some challenges between USEC and Manadam and their executive agent 10X agreeing on prices even for the enrichment component, that led to some interruptions of the whole agreement overall, um, as well as an effort among Cameco and Kojima and Newchem to perhaps come to a deal with Mikhailov on how to market that stuff. I think negotiations picked up in the 96, 97, 98 period with some prospect of success until privatization.
Yes, but there's a component here that I pointed out to you that comes back to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Uh, One, they were unhappy about the matching deal, but more fundamentally, Canada was very concerned about what was going to happen to the feed component under the HEU deal. So in 94, there was an overture by Canada to DOC, no, USTR and state. And DOE was not in that meeting, but there was an overture under NAFTA to talk about the matching agreement and how that violated NAFTA. And oh, by the way, what are you doing with this feed component that once again will destroy the market? And the response was, we hear you on matching. We'll look at its impact. We'll try to make sure Canada is not hurt, whatever that meant. But we're not authorized to talk about, in fact, we're not knowledgeable, the State Department people, in this meeting about the HEU deal. And that got reported back to me and also back to Tom. And then ultimately, we convinced the Canadian government to pursue a complaint under NAFTA about the matching program, but we didn't care that much about the matching program because, as you pointed out, it didn't look like it was going to work anyway. What we wanted to do was to get the US's attention on what Cameco could do vis-a-vis the HEU agreement and the feed component. And so a complaint was filed, and then that led to another meeting that I attended in Washington. And again, then DOE was engaged, and Timby was there. One of who was the individual that kept track of U.S. production with DOE, I think, or maybe DOC. I can't remember. Anyway, I'll think of his name. But anyway, there was a cast of about 5 people from this U.S. government. And we had representatives from the Canadian government, me, and we began to explain the implications of the HEU deal, the feed component in particular, and the enrichment component as we saw their impact on the market. Number one, enrichment plants in the US are at risk. 2, conversion is at risk. And 3, the feed component needs to be managed, as does conversion, in a way that it looks like a new mine coming in. And, we're prepared to work on a solution.
Was that the first time you met Timby?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Jim had been threaded throughout the whole
He had.
deal before that. So the fact that he was at the meeting was the right people were starting to align from the commercial and the governmental
That's
side.
exactly. And of course, Tom was not in the meeting and not mentioned.
But they had been
But
graduate students together.
yeah, exactly. I mean, he said, okay, now you're beginning to get the right people. You're beginning to get the attention of the right people in the government. And he was ecstatic. But then he knew, okay, now there's an avenue to basically advance the role that Cameco could play. You know, back in, and this was in 94, ultimately, the free trade agreement complaint was resolved, I think, probably after the Domenici 95 legislation was enacted, because Canada was very supportive of that as a resolution from a uranium commercial perspective. Because generally in free trade agreement complaints, they trade off one commodity, such as uranium, for some other commodity like eggs or bacon or something. And we said that's not going to work. We need a commercial solution. So the enactment of the Domenici legislation, I think, was the solution to the free trade agreement complaint. And by this point in time, we were interacting with state as and Tom was as well on, getting people creative about how do you solve this. And we then knew that the Russians owned it, and we knew that it was going to come in according to this quota, and we didn't have to argue about the suspension agreement any longer. There was another important thing. Sorry, I just keep going back and forth, but
No, no.
there was another important decision made by Spatrini and DOC because somebody in the US government had really pissed him off about the suspension agreement. I can't, and Tom related, and I have to go back into my notes, but he came back in a meeting very aggressive. Spatrini did, according to Tom, and said the suspension agreement is the suspension agreement. It isn't going to be altered. It's not going to be circumvented. And LEU from Russia is subject to it. And whether that was a DOC position or just in any event, that was a big issue. Was the LEU from Russia subject at all to the suspension agreement? And that had to be clarified. And Tom was adamant that it needed to be. Otherwise, the deal falls apart because all this material comes in not subject to the suspension agreement, and the Russians never get paid what they expect. And the market gets destroyed. So somewhere along the way, that decision by DOC was absolutely crucial to the ultimate design of the feed component deal, as was the legislation, the ownership issue, and Mikhailov ultimately getting permission to take some back to Russia if need be, that got worked out later. I mean, all these components had to get fixed, and Tom's hand was in all of it.
Your comments remind me just of how complicated this was to even get a kind of a baseline of understanding. You're, having to deal with the Department of Commerce and state and USTR and DOE, the commercial parties. I could imagine whoever agitated Joe Spatrini, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for these uranium issues and others. It may have been someone in the non-proliferation realm that was worried about nuclear security in Russia and just like we need to get them money, without the detailed understanding of all these sensitive domestic market issues and constituencies and so forth. So there's a lot of room for misunderstanding even within the government trying to coordinate amongst itself, let alone understand the commercial, the esoteric commercial aspects of this.
Yeah. You would know better than me, but all of the reports I got from the industry and people in DOC was that Spatrini was under intense pressure for all variety of reasons to relax, to change, to amend. He's under pressure from Russia, but then he had the CIS states. Were they going to get the matching deal as well or not? What about their material in competition with the HEU material? These restrictions need to be lifted because now they're market economies.
Hmm.
So yeah, in some respects, I felt sorry for him. But um, so
So against that backdrop on NAFTA being solved by the de minimis legislation, there, your your involvement almost stepped up another notch in trying to come to an agreement with 10X and Manatom on the feed component.
and there were meetings in 94, 95, 93, 94, where Tom and I actually went to meetings with the Russians together and tried to persuade them that a joint venture or some construct, and we were quite flexible, and needed to be done to address their concerns about getting paid for the feed component. So I know he went to at least one meeting in Moscow, one meeting in DC. I think I had met with Alex Flint on Domenici's staff, but somewhere in the 95 period of time, as I was going in and out of Manhattan and seeing the French going in and out of Manhattan at the same time. And because Kojima was a partner of ours in the mining and milling operations in Canada, um, and I was still senior VP of marketing and corporate development, and my boss, who was French, Bernard Michel, École Polytechnique, he knew all the Kojima people. Of course, he used to work with them when he was in the potash industry. He hated them, and he hated and distrusted the French. So it dawned on me that, look, we got all kinds of people competing for this material. Unlikely anybody's ever going to make a lot of money on this. We need to get it stabilized. We need to get it controlled. If there's ever a hope that the market will recover even enough to cover production costs, let's invite Kojima to be a partner. So I go to my boss, who hates Kojima, and say, this is what we're going to do, Bernard. And after some reflection, he agreed. So then I went to Coupon, and the head of Kojima at the time, and said, let's create a partnership and we will stop this nonsense in Manhattan of having us compete against one another. And we'll present a united front. And together, financially, we'll be able to handle any investment that needs to be done to make this work. And they readily agreed. And by then, Fletch was my translator. Fletcher had worked for me at Energy Fuels, and then he was independent or working for Benton, I think. So I had another translator that Cameco used over there by the name of Sergei Breus. And all the while this is going on, I was negotiating with Kazakhstan, with Katep, to get my hands on the world's biggest uranium ore body in Kazakhstan, like 1 billion pounds of uranium. So I sent Sergey down there and hired Fletch to be the interpreter and had Sergey help us down there. But there's so much in my notes that are intertwined between worrying about Kazakhstan's ability to sell and entering into a joint venture with them and the meaning of all of the suspension agreements and affecting Kazakhstan. Anyway,
Wow.
we're working on all these deals at the same time. So we invite Kojima to partner with us. They agree. Um, Then the issue was, okay, so who speaks? And you know how arrogant the French are. Um, it was going to be their show, but after the first meeting, it was Cameco's show. And Fletch became the interpreter for everybody. But of course, each company had their cast of 5 people. But in one meeting in particular in Moscow, and it was the meeting where we advised the ministry and Tenex that Kojima and Cameco were now partners, which didn't make them very happy. Um, we're getting nowhere. It was Igorov that was the principal negotiator with the Tenex people, and Igorov was always unreasonable about his price expectations and ignored lots of issues about where you could sell it and under the suspension agreement and its impact and how much risk the companies needed to take. This would be after several meetings, just Cameco, where we had folded our papers and walked out of the meeting because it was just so frustrating. And then the pattern was ministry would call us up in our hotel room, please come back, or ask us to come back a few months later. So in this particular meeting, with Yves Coupon sitting next to me and the unreasonable demands from Egorov, I lean over to Yves and I say, fold your papers. We're leaving. Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. That would be insulting. I said, Yves, fold your papers. We're leaving. So we did, and we walked out. One meeting later, like maybe 5 months later, we're in a meeting in DC. Again, 10X and Egorov are being unreasonable. Eve leans over to me and goes, time to fold our papers. So we became the lead negotiator, as you know, and basically dictated how this was going to transpire. And the relationship that Cameco had with Neff, which basically trying to get this thing to work by frequent calls, was never disclosed to Kojima. They were probably talking to Neff as well, but his name was just never mentioned. Okay. Everybody knew how instrumental he was and the father of the deal. But now, as the company's trying to implement it, we're focused on our own transaction. In the meantime, I'm still constantly communicating with Neff because our negotiations are going nowhere. And now we got Nuchem competing, the Germans, Nuchem being the trader broker. That's the worst of all possible worlds. Then getting married with Shusterovich and, you know, representing a competing deal and making all kinds of promises to the ministry and to 10X about what they could do in terms of raising money, selling material, and you know, God knows what role Shusterovich actually had in the transaction. There are lots of ideas about that, but we saw absolutely no reason why he needed to be in the picture.
One just a brief comment here. One thing that became more clear to me after looking back in history is how contorted Moscow itself was in competition amongst the oligarchs. And from the backdrop of the Cold War, it's like you think the Soviet Union knows how to act as a state in its own interest, but I think some of what Mikhailov was maneuvering about wasn't simply as it was portrayed at the time in various press that, you know, he was out looking out for his own economic interest. I think he was trying to protect Manhattan against the predations of the oligarchs and their banks and
All the banks, all the
to
Alpha Bank and Lebedev and on and on and on. And we were quite aware, and Tenex was quite honest about all of this machinations going on in Russia about who's going to control the revenue stream. Where is it going to end up? And of course, Mikhailov's scared to death and trying to maneuver so that it goes to Manhattan to
Right.
where it's supposed to be to support his scientists and industries. But that was a big issue. Yeah, absolutely.
So I mean, the irony was is that the the enrichment component that he had kind of a lock on, its deliveries to the U.S. were paced by the ability to sell that orphan uranium created in the U.S. because of the customs thing. You couldn't ship out the HEU, the enrichment product, without somehow dealing with an etched uranium component. So the whole deal started to
Yeah.
buck and stop and start again with an effort to resolve the feed component, which remained difficult and then would soon even get harder after USEC privatization.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, we continue to meet with the Russians, but then, as you point out, and that prompts the chapter is, okay, USEC is privatized, and now you got a revelation that they end up with lots of uranium of their own.
And
40 million
I think that's right. It was
pounds equivalent
in
of
their IPO S1 filing.
yeah, which was a shock to the industry. Well, now you have another source in competition with producers, but in competition with the HEU feed component as well.
And if recollection serves, the in the negotiations with your partner companies and 10X Manatom, it was beginning to hone in 98 on an agreed price that, and of course, the bottom fell out of the Russian economy under Yeltsin in that period.
Mhm.
And Dep new Prime Minister Kirienko approved this price that you hope would go forward with 10X just prior to the
Yeah.
IPO revelations, which you mentioned. And so
Mhm.
then you've got this approved benchmark that Manadam 10X says is okay, but it makes it more politically to move off of that down the road, so you can't adjust with market conditions. And so it's like we're even more of a corner.
Mhm. Yeah, and then so the deal unravels. Um, and Tom's apoplectic
I remember.
because he sees this as we do, as destabilizing and a threat to the overall deal. And then how are you going to really deal with it and make it predictable? Um,
And
so
Mikhailov was out. Mikhailov was out by that point. He was out in March 1998. So we got a new minister in
you got Adamov coming in.
with Rizhov.
Um, Say again?
With Rizhov.
With Rizhov and Vinogradov. Vinogradov, I'd known for a decade or longer. Rizhov was, I think, new to me. I may have met him once before, but and Vinogradov was a very interesting guy and always unruffled, but bright as hell. But we had to the Shusterovich engagement and had to begin dealing with that and saying to everybody, we don't see any reason why we as Western companies, in that time it would have been Kojima and Cameco, need an agent in the middle of this. And it would be Shusterovich, GNSS, or later it was Shusterovich and GNSS and Nuchem in combination. Absolutely no reason why we needed an agent. And then the concern, well, monies that we send in payment for the feed component, where are they going to go? We need the assurance that they're going to go to the intended person and the intended purpose, which perfectly aligns with your interest in Tom. So ultimately, for whatever reason, Mikhailov gets shuffled aside, and Adamov comes in, and he refuses to meet with Cameco and Kojima. Um, and why? Not sure, other than the departure of his predecessor may have had something to do with it in terms of be careful who you deal with.
What I learned at the time and reminded myself more recently was from a Neff memo. He went shortly um, after Adamov was appointed to meet with Rizhov and learned, and Tom reported this back to the U.S. government. He learned that Rizhov was charged by Adamov to review what all this commercial competition was about, and could there be a return to the original deal or not. And so Tom had to kind of walk him through the history and why the U.S. government couldn't just buy it out of their budget and so on. And so I think part of the explanation for Adamov not meeting with you is there was this review period, and he was kind of stepping back and putting the monkey on Rizhov's back to sort this out for a while.
So, and maybe true. I went over, or not, I didn't go, but there was a trip by the Minister of Natural Resources, and that'd be Ralph Goodale, who's a Saskatchewan person, whom I know quite well, and Bill Richardson. So it was a joint trip to Moscow. Canada and presumably Richardson fully briefed on the status of all of this. I know that Goodale was, and they met with Adamov. And shortly after that meeting, then we reconnected, re-engaged with Adamov and Tenex. And according to Richardson, no, according to Goodale, it took some assurances that Cameco was okay to deal with as a Canadian company and was serious about trying to solve this feed component issue. What Richardson said, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm. I think perhaps by that point, Richardson may have appointed his one and only undersecretary, Ernie Moniz, to be the point person to work with Adamov to try to
Yeah,
reconcile this.
probably.
There was I think it was September 98 that Yeltsin complained to Clinton at a summit in Moscow that the HEU agreement wasn't working and he might have to pull out. And that led to a charge to both Richardson and Adamov to like fix this.
Get it done. Yeah.
And
So go ahead.
no.
Again, the sequence of events here is escaping me, but at some point in time, I think after the meeting, Richardson and Adamov, Goodale meeting, Shusterovich was still somehow in the picture. And there was a meeting to be held with Tenex in Washington, D.C. Kojima, Cameco, and we kept being told that Nukem was now a competitor, the Germans, and that they were offering a better deal, and Tom was reporting all this back to us. And we just couldn't quite understand it, but it was this ceaseless competition. The Russians kept trying to interject into this deal with players that talked a good game, pretended they could address the issue, but didn't have the financial wherewithal to do it. Just proved to be quite bothersome and time consuming, and getting in the way of getting something done. So I called up Kurt Schreiber with the permission of Kojima and said, cut the nonsense, Kurt, and head of Nukem. Why don't you come into the deal for 10% and just get out of the way? And again, nobody believed that this was going to be profitable. It's just that we needed to get it stabilized, predictable, and behind all of this, nobody could argue with dismantling 20,000 Russian nuclear warheads.
Mhm.
And that was said repeatedly to virtually everybody we talked to, because lots of people would say, well, let it crater. Just let it die. And, it's too complicated. And, then you'll go back to a market where there's the overhang, but you're not having to deal with it immediately. But we knew this was going to come, and it needed to be done properly, and nobody was going to stand in the way of dismantling the weapons and ultimately having this material find its way into the market. So Schreiber agreed, and now there's three Western companies. And nobody told the Russians that this had transpired. So here we are at a meeting in DC. Egorov is still principal, but Shusterovich is the only one authorized to speak. And it's in the bowels of the Westin Hotel, and Cameco had arranged the room. So we arrived well ahead of the meeting, and down the stairs comes Shusterovich with Egorov and 10X. And I promptly say to Shusterovich, we rented the room and you're not welcome. And you can't come in. So he hems and haws and he leaves. And then in the room are Egorov and 10X, but they have no authority to say anything.
Somewhere in an interview, Yegorov is quoted, the HEU deal was like a fairy tale. The further it went, the darker it got.
Well, for him, that's true. In any event, I think that was the last time we saw him, but that meeting was completely counterproductive. We outlined the fact now we got three Western companies. We're prepared to move forward. You just need to begin to be responsive on the terms of the deal that we've outlined to you. So then after that, negotiations, Shusterovich disappears. And so we no longer need to deal with him. And now we're really just talking with 10X and Rizhov and Vinogradov. And then, the series of meetings in Moscow and Paris and DC, and ultimately culminating in the meeting in Paris with you and Ernie, where we're hammering out the details of the transaction, the option elements, the stockpiles, the withholding of material from the marketplace, all intending to manipulate ultimately the price of uranium so that the risk is reduced to the Western companies. And ultimately, the Russians will get the value out of the feed component that they expect as part of the overall transaction. The structure of it turned out to be a lot different than the notion of a joint venture that we had originally. Companies ended up with options, and literally out of that, no commitment to take anything. And the price of uranium was quite low, and the Russians understood that. But the promise that to the extent we didn't take, they could return to a stockpile in Russia, And then there were controls on that as to what could be used. And then the promises, the U.S. government stepping in earlier with second piece of legislation that dealt with the 97, 98 material, having paid for it subject to, and this is important, the Russians entering into a partnership with, I forget the terminology, Western companies, Western producers, or some legitimate partner, which was code for Cameco and Kojima, and then later for Nuclear. And that's when the game was over, according, I mean, again, Tom's hand was all over that. Domenici did it with Alex. And once they were put in that box, you're not going to get paid for this material and the 325 million unless you enter into a partnership. Once that was in law, then basically it was game over and it was all right, then how do we come to the terms of how this is going to work over a 20-year period of time? Because that was always an issue too. The Russians only wanted a 5-year deal with, and then they wanted their own place in the market. That was always a big issue in the early days too.
It was surprising to me at the time how long it actually took to still get agreement with that 325 million
Yeah.
card, because as you mentioned, there were meetings in Washington, ultimately one in December of 98 in Paris, that there was a handshake agreement on at least the terms, the commercial terms, that still had to embody that in the full final contract by what turned out to be
Mm-hmm.
March 99. But there were remaining issues still about the title to the uranium, and I think you were in the forefront of trying to get as maximal legal protections going forward by getting clarity from the Russian government about who had the authority to buy and sell commercially under this new commercial agreement. I mean, this governmental agreement that kind of mended the HEU deal overall by putting together the feed component deal with the
Mm-hmm.
enrichment deal.
Well, I think the U.S. government and we needed the decrees, if you will, and literally we wanted them from the Russian government so that we knew under all the laws that we need to pay attention to, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and all of these things, that the money and people we're dealing with had the authority that they represented. And I think you wanted decrees as well.
Mhm.
And then there was parallel pronouncements by the U.S. government. And then it was understood that every amendment, of which there were something like 13, would have the same kind of treatment. And indeed, over the implementation of it, every time the Russians wanted to engage in an amendment, we went back to the Russian government and got a decree, right? We had to deal with the U.S. stockpile as well to make sure that was held off the market for 10 years. Again, all intent on supporting the price of uranium in our interest and in the Russians' interest. But you had 3 competitors sitting around the table, agreeing with a 4th competitor, i.e. Russia, that we're going to withhold material from the market, and Kojima and Cameco saying among themselves, and we will delay the development of Cigar Lake so that that's not competing with the implementation of the HEU deal, all of which are antitrust violations. And you'll remember my intervention, maybe, at the final hour when I busted into your final meeting with the Russians saying this doesn't go anywhere without something from the US government that says all of these manipulations of the market, which are in this commercial agreement, they all need to be blessed by the US government because that's immunity under U.S. antitrust law. When you're directed to do that by the U.S. government, then that's a defense under U.S. antitrust law.
And the hoops that the U.S. government was jumping through was to how to get the Russian uranium back that wasn't sold by the companies in the U.S. and onto the market back to Russia in the absence of a 123 agreement for
Exactly.
cooperation.
And all of that you guys figured out. So that, here again, Russians saw some material return. I think that was important politically. It was important for blending ultimately. And from a market perspective, anything going back to Russia that wouldn't reappear except through the hands of the Western companies, which was the agreement, was positive for the market.
Do you remember by chance, it was a close run thing where Primakov was flying to Washington in March 1999 with the decrees, and his plane gets turned around in the middle over the Atlantic, and Adamov is, well, I'll let you pick up the tale from
Well,
there because it
yeah,
must have been kind of a shock
to all of us.
to all of us. Yeah.
So Primakov is going to come to sign the deal. We're all there. Kojima, Nukem, Cameco, State Department, DOE. It's going to be at the, well, I think originally it was going to be at State Department. It got moved to DOE for some reason, and his plane gets turned around. And now what's going to happen? And then we're told that Adamov has been given the authority to sign. That's my recollection. And so we engage in the signing, Richardson, Adamov, and the three companies.
Yeah, it was
And the catalyst for being turned around was what
Kosovo.
we bombed, U.S. bombed,
Was it Kosovo? And it was
yeah, it was some Balkan country.
Serbia and Kosovo, and it
I
was
think that's right.
the
Yeah.
U.S. initiated
Yeah.
airstrikes, and it was just too politically dicey for
Yeah.
Primakov to,
Politically too difficult. Yeah.
and so all it was a Gorchir-Namirdin commission, and so all the other ministers were in town for this big meeting, and they all left town like following Primakov, but Adamov was given license to stay. But
Yeah.
the operational consequence that was that the ceremonies you mentioned got accelerated, but yet like there were still some details in the commercial contract to get copies, and Kuchinov and I were working on some of the details, and so up all night. But there was this recollection by one of the company's representatives, or maybe a Russian one. It was like in the middle of the night, the world's leading uranium companies were running around Washington, D.C. to try to find a copy machine to make. Anyway, I didn't know if you had any recollections from that period.
A little bit. I think we'd sent Fletcher out to do something like that, and
Yeah.
I will say in those final negotiations where we had the U.S. there, we had the Russians and the three Western companies, that everybody then began to rely on Fletcher. We just cut out the other translators that had been brought because by then he was so trusted by the Russians that when they wanted to understand something that was being said, they wouldn't turn to their translator. They'd ask ours. And I have to hand it to his demeanor and his capability. It became extraordinary, really, on how much people then relied on not just the words, but the emotion. So, when the Russians were getting excited, or I was, that came through his translation. It wasn't just words, it was the underlying emotion. And I can remember when I was asking for too much in that final negotiation in Paris, and Moniz took me to the woodshed and said, be reasonable. You got enough?
He said more than that, didn't he? I don't know. I'd be interested to know what he said.
Yeah, he did, Jeff. He said more than that. The implication was get it done and be
Yeah,
happy.
he never told me what he said. I got the gist of it.
Yeah, well, he said a lot. But the message was abundantly clear. So we went back and properly concluded the negotiations. But in that back and forth, Fletcher was representing and translating that the emotions of the Russians and ours, which were escalating. I'll remember that to this very day about how important it wasn't just the words. It was the emotion behind the words. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we interviewed Fletcher recently, and he noted when he was first taking Russian in college, it didn't resonate that well with him. But then he went to Vermont to a language school at which he met Solzhenitsyn, and he heard him talking, and it's like, oh, that's different Russian from what I've been learning. And so I think, and then he really got into it and went over to St. Petersburg to study. And so I think that was an important moment for him in
Yeah.
sort of
So when
capturing
I
the
would
emotion behind the language.
travel with him, to Moscow many, many times, we'd be taking a walk, getting some fresh air. We'd engage one of their street artists or whatever to do portraits and charcoal. And I'd say, well, where do you think Fletch is from? And I'd ask the artist or whomever we were interacting with. Maybe we're at the flea market in the middle of December or something. They'd think about it and go, well, he's got a little bit of an accent, maybe Estonia, perhaps Georgia. Never would guess that he was from Denver, Colorado.
Right, right.
So a remarkable talent. Um, where are we?
Well, I was going to say, Jerry, we've been going for over 2 hours, and I mean, what we might propose to you to do is come back at a later time to pick it up after March 99 and perhaps a briefer discussion of how this moved into the 2000s and your role there and some of the
Jeff, I
vignettes
think that's
about.
a good suggestion. Um, yeah, I've taken you on way too many tangents already.
No, no, no.
These are very good. These are
And
not
I think,
talented. These are
uh, Andrea, I think that like 99 and on will go much faster.
there,
But yeah,
Yeah, but
should
don't
we?
worry about the timing. I think that is important for us to have this, what you describe as tangent, actually they are not, right? This observation about Fletcher and emotions, for example, on our side, on the side of those who are working on conflict resolution, cooperations, these are insights that are very important. I picked up on a few things that you said, for example, about this overall overarching awareness that the 20,000 bombs were actually present all along, that there was this very, very serious issue of an agreement that is not just a piece of paper that you sign, but is an enormous work that goes into it to make sure that the agreement stays together, is conceived correctly, and is viable, is possible and so on. So we'll definitely have more to talk. I think it's very wise what Jeff is suggesting. It's good to close for today and then re-engage subsequently.
I might point out that some of the details you went through at the beginning, they actually continue to play a subtle role that we didn't have time to get into, such as the GNSS enterprise that you mentioned, which was sort of yet an additional commercial arm to 10X, which had been established years before. The struggle over the ownership of those shares by
Yeah.
Pleiades was part of the ongoing story going forward for control of GNSS under Adamov and other problems that arose from that. So those details get threaded through.
Yeah. Not to mention the arrest of McCarran, who was the son of, again, a very good friend in the Ministry of Atomic Energy, Evgeny McCarran, his dad. So I knew the dad, and I knew I knew the son who ultimately went to jail. Yeah, okay.
But some
So
of those were later exonerated too, like Adamov himself, that it gets tied
well,
back to that tangle.
yeah.
But
Fletch and I did he mention to you we actually went over and visited Adamov while he was in jail?
no, okay, well, we'll save that.
Now, try to do that these days.
I mean, yeah, well, we'll save that as a teaser for going forward. But
Because
and
he became a very good friend, reliable, and we go, well, we don't understand why he's incarcerated, but we're going to go see him.
I mean, the very quick version is that he had circumvented the Russian government to get nuclear security payments from DOE to go to his Nikiet lab before he was minister, which is very hard to explain in Russia to defend, even though he was exonerated in a U.S. court.
Hmm.
And I believe in the struggle to keep control for Manhattan over GNSS, they had to buy that stock, and that again could be made to look suspicious. And
Yeah.
anyway, he was ultimately exonerated by Russian courts, and more recently was given a medal by Putin, and he's back at
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, he's working on his fast
Oh,
reactors
okay.
for Nikiet. So yeah, it's a
Do you
complicated and
think
strange story.
you'll ever be able to interview some of the Russian actors on this?
I
Very
hope
good. We were actually exploring this. I think it would be also a sign in many ways that the situation is moving in the right direction, right? One of the things that is quite surprising in these interviews that is very, very clear that the level of exchange and relationship in the 70s, 80s, 90s between Soviet Union and the US is actually better than now. It's a very interesting complexity. So we have some contact in the US, and of course, Jeff has contact in Russia too. But ideally, it would be good. But for the moment, we are focusing on the American side.
so. Well, again, thank you so much for your generous availability of your time, and I'm sure as you reflect more, and perhaps we would come back for an interview sometime after the June workshop, depending on your attendance there or not. But there'll be more exposure to more information, and you may more memories may click because just by refreshing the material, you were thinking of things today in real time. So
Very good, and look forward to it.